In this video, I want to try something a little bit different. I'm going to be doing a design retrospective of a game that I designed, Dwarf Mine, and I want to talk about how the idea came to me all the way back in 2015, how the design concept changed over time, why I made the decisions I made. I'll be showing some of my old design notes and where the game is today. Because this is a little bit different, I'd really appreciate it if you could include in the comments below if you like this type of thing or if you don't like it. And then we'll be back to something that I do more regularly next week in some vintage gaming stuff. So I want to get started by just talking about what is Dwarf Mine. Dwarf Mine is a solo tabletop game where you are going to be drawing and designing a mine, uncovering treasure, and fighting monsters within a mountain. Basically, in Dwarf Mine, on graph paper, you draw your mine, roll dice to determine what gold, gems, and other treasure you find, and eventually you fight monsters and hopefully defeat them, keeping your mine alive and thriving. By the end of the game, you'll have created a rich and unique history for your mine, and no two games are the same. Now, Dwarf Mine is a success for me personally. It's a silver bestseller on Drive-Thru RPG. I have sold multiple hundreds of copies, so I'm very happy with its success. I'm no Anna Blackwell, so this isn't like an astounding title that's, selling thousands of copies or anything like that, but I'm happy with where it is, and I've had a lot of really great interactions with people online who enjoy playing the game, and my favorite part personally is when people share the mines that they build, because again, everybody's mine is different. The rooms they come up with are so interesting. The history of their mine is really fun to read, and I think it's a really, really fun game. However, Dwarf Mine didn't start out this way. Dwarf Mine started all the way back in 2015. I was in a creative mood, I guess you could say, and I was looking for ideas of games I could play, and I thought to myself, wouldn't it be fun if if I could create a game that you could draw on graph paper? And there's an old game called Sim Ant, and Sim Ant is a game where you take control of an ant colony, you basically expand through a backyard, and you try and fight other ants and make your colony the best ant colony in the backyard. I think it was a fun game, but I don't remember too much about it because I quickly moved on to other games because of the theme. And so when I started designing Dwarf Mine, the first theme I had in my mind was an ant colony, but I knew that wasn't going to be the final theme. It was just the idea to get me going, and very, very quickly I changed the theme from ants over to dwarfs. I went back today and looked at my original design document, one of the first things I could find about Dwarf Mine, and it was pretty interesting to see because it looked like Dwarf Mine initially was something that was more like, there's those games where they're called the runner games, where your character's running and you got to jump or duck under obstacles. It was like that, but it was vertical in nature, so that you started at the top and you were going to dig on your way downwards, and the further you digged or dug in the mine, the different types of events you would encounter and the treasures you could find. So the initial thought was a vertical style game based on graph paper, but it changed over time. Now, before I talk about how it changed, I wanted to mention how I design in real life and digitally. So one of the things that I do is, and it's over there, so I'm not going to grab it. No, I'll grab it. One of the things that I do and have everywhere with me pretty much is a design notebook. And essentially, I take this with me on all my trips. It's always next to my desk when I am working. And the idea of the design notebook here is that if an idea comes to me, I can quickly write it down on paper. And I've found that I'm most creative when I am working with pencil and paper. When I move to the computer, I'm a little bit less creative, but I'm a little bit more productive. And so I like to have a design notebook on standby. I do quick hitting thoughts, ideas in the notebook. And every once in a while, if I have time and I'm feeling creative, I'll sit down and I'll do a design challenge, or I'll tackle a problem with the design, or I might even do play tests within my design notebook. So that is one of the main tools I use to design. And I can go back to, I think as far as 2017, I think I have Dwarf Mine notes in my notebook. I also have a giant Google Drive folder called Game Designs. It's got over 100 different folders which represent different games, and it's in there that I usually take the design ideas I have from my notebook and try and turn them into something a little bit more publishable, a little bit more formal, where I can then write out the rules, or I can put down random lists or things like that. And that is where I get productive within my game design. And so I have those two different resources that I use, my game design notebook and my Google Drive folders, and that allows me to basically build out these games over time. Now, Dwarf Mine, the design lasted from 2015 through today in 2023, but the first game, the initial base game, came out in 2020, and that's not uncommon for me. What I've found with my designs is I will go through these, I guess, sprints where I get really excited about an idea and I work and work and work, and then usually I hit a wall. And at that point, I put it down and I might not visit it for 6 months, 8 months, a year, or maybe even more than a year until either something clicks or I'm just doing an audit of my design notes and I say, hey, I kind of liked that idea. What was the issue? I go back, read my notes, and I realize what the issue is, and I have a fresh set of eyes to look at it. And so it's not uncommon for a game like Dwarf Mine to last 5 years before it gets published, and to have even more development after that. I have 3 or 4 games right now that have gone through playtesting that have been in development for about 5 years, but I have a problem that I haven't been able to solve or haven't had time to go after, and it's just kind of how my mind works and given my life right now. So that's how I do it. Anyways, it was back in 2015 when I got the design concept, the idea that you would start at the top of a graph paper, you draw your way down, and different events would happen. In 2017, I began expanding on this idea, and I did a lot of expansion. In fact, I did so much expansion that the game resembled more of an RPG, something that would have like 100 pages of rules or something like that, and it was honestly too big, but it was a good exercise because it gave me a lot of ideas to kind of move on from. So I improved the rules, first of all, so the rules actually made sense in 2017. I had dwarf leaders, which did end up making it into a mini expansion in the base game where each dwarf leader would have like different unique actions you can do in the game. I had like a giant event table with over 120 different events, and my goal, I think, was to get to something like 500 different events. Remember, it was a top-down drawing game, so the idea was as you went down further, you would get more and more events as you went down, and that would, of course, make those events more terrifying and more wondrous and more powerful, but you would also be able to handle that more in the game. I had a room list, and it was relatively similar to how the game turned out. I had items that you could get from within the mine or you could craft. I had trading and other, I guess, factions and humans and elves that you could, you'd have like a relationship tracker, and you'd have to try and appease the elves or appease the humans, and that would open up trading. I had military training, so your troops you could invest in your troops and they would get better. And then I had yearly events where every year you would roll a dice and something different would happen. Again, the result of this 2017 design sprint that I did was that the game got too big. But I did something really, really good during this design sprint. Is I realized the game got too big. And so what I did is I sat down and I wrote in my notebook, my design notebook, what some of the issues were. I did some solo play testing, and I realized there were some problems. Number one, there was a lot of dice rolling. Every single turn you'd be rolling the dice. It was like, if I'm remembering correctly, 15 or 20 times. And it was just, as fun as dice rolling is, that's too much. I remember talking about how the game was too big in my design notebook. And so one of the things I did is I really focused on the concept. What was the core idea of this game? And the core idea was to draw a lot, and for the drawing that you're making to impact gameplay. In other words, I wanted more freedom with how you could draw your mine, and I wanted how you drew your mine to impact how your mine would survive. And those were kind of the two core design principles that I moved forward with from 2017. Looking back in 2017, I actually thought, when I was looking at my notes earlier today, I thought that I was designing like a 4X game at the time, and I think I was kind of using some of the concepts from that 4X game in my Dwarf Mine game, and that's why it ballooned so much in the in the scope of what I was designing. So in 2017, I put it down for a little bit. I picked it back up in 2018, and I continued some design and development through 2018. And one of the one of the things I really started looking at was I understood that it was too big, but I also had so many ideas. So I added a lot of ideas, but I thinned down on a lot of the ideas that I had in 2017. So I added in 2018 ideas of magic, the fact that you could cast spells in your mind, and that made it into one of the expansions. I talked about upgrades and how you could upgrade this or that in the mind. I talked about, I built a name generator. So you could generate names for your rooms or for your dwarves, and that made it as a mini expansion into the game. And ultimately what I realized after reviewing my notes in 2018 was the game was getting closer to what it is today. Now, around the same time period, 2017, 2018, I also found a game online that really helped me push forward with Dwarf Mine, and that game was How to Host a Dungeon. If you haven't seen How to Host a Dungeon, check it out. Basically, it's a dungeon drawing, dungeon building game. It's solo. It's like a dungeon generating game. It's more of an activity than a game, but there are a few gameplay elements, and I thought it was fun to do once or twice. It's not something that I sit down and play all the time, but it was really inspiring for me at the time because I loved playing these and designing these print and play tabletop paper and pencil games. But I wasn't sure, like I thought this was gonna be a free game and that nobody would ever wanna spend money on it. I wasn't even sure if there was a market for these types of things. And then I found How to Host Your Dungeon and I realized, oh, that person is selling this game. If they're selling this game, I can sell Dwarf Mine. And so it was really inspiring for me to see that game out there. I also frequently look for tabletop games to try and see how other designers hadn't handled problems that I have in my games. I don't know if there was any direct inspiration from How to Host Your Dungeon, but as far as mechanics go, but I do know I was greatly inspired by the fact that it existed and somebody was able to go out there, put something out there, sell it, and for people to enjoy it. So that brings us to 2019. In 2019, I realized I was ready to run a playtest. I also wasn't ready to run a playtest. So the game was ready, but I did not have a playtest document. I didn't have succinct rules. I didn't have like a Dwarf Mine map or a mine sheet where you could track resources for the mine. And so what I did was I committed to a playtest during my friend's annual Extra Life event. I got, I think, 5 or 6 people to play it, and then 2 weeks before the event I was scrambling trying to put together a packet of playtest rules and resources that I could sit down and have people play. And it was a smashing success in the fact that the playtest worked. Playtesting is always interesting. It can be devastating at times because the things that you're excited about seeing might not work, but it's so beneficial to your game because you can see how players, people who maybe who have never seen your game, who've never interacted with your game, maybe don't have quite as much of an interest in your game as you do, how they react. And I learned a lot from this playtest. There was a ton in the rules that was way too confusing, so I changed some rules to try and make it simpler. I streamlined things, but the biggest change in this game came in combat. In this initial playtest, there was one event you would roll per year. And so, per year. So you would draw your rooms, you would gather your resources, and then you would roll one event. And one of my playtesters said, hey, I never got to fight anything. And I looked at my chart and I realized that was incredibly unrealistic that that would occur all the time. The combat was about 50% and treasure was about 50%. But I talked to some of the other playtesters and I realized there was an expectation for playing a tabletop game in this genre that their dwarves would be fighting something every single year. And that seems to be the case in media about dwarves, right? They're always fighting. And I realized, why am I trying to fight this idea that dwarves won't always be fighting? So I ended up splitting that event table into 2. In today's game, there is a treasure table you roll every year, every turn, and there is a monster table or enemy table you roll every year or every turn. And that was directly from that very first playtest. After the first playtest, the game was in pretty good shape. I did some subsequent small play tests. I fixed some things. I ordered art, and then COVID hit. So the game was put down for a while. I ended up releasing the playtest rules in a free blog post, for free in a blog post that is still by far the most popular blog post I've ever had. There was a few other playtest rules in there as well. It was like May of COVID, and I just wanted people to be able to play something at home and have fun. And I think a lot of people enjoyed that, and like a lot of people. So that was nice to see. Got a lot of really good encouragement and engagement from people and communication online about that. So that was fun. And then that brought me to basically 2020. I published the game in late 2020, if I'm remembering correctly. And there was something, before publishing, there's something that was challenging for me to do. And in design work, a lot of times you hear the phrase, kill your darlings. And basically what that means is if you have an idea that you're really, really excited about, but it doesn't match with your core design idea, then you might have to get rid of it. And that was the case for a lot of my the ideas that I had. If you look at the list of things I had planned in 2017, that had been whittled down to almost nothing in the game that I released in 2020. But it was really important for me to do that because I needed a game that was easy to learn, easy to play. You could sit down, learn it, and play it and finish it in 45 minutes, and that was my goal. I also wanted all the mechanics to support the core design idea, which was that you had the freedom to draw the mine you wanted to, and that the way you drew your mine would impact gameplay. And I think I did a pretty good job at the end of the day with that. I think I ended up, I'd give myself maybe a B on the design. I think looking back, there's a few things I would change in the core rules, but I think overall I hit my design philosophy. And like I said, the game's been pretty successful, so I'm pretty excited about that. Now, after it released in 2020, I ended up putting out expansions. I ended up putting out a few mini free expansions that were included in the base game. I added more rooms to the game because one of the big, I guess, critical comments that I had from a few different people was that most of the games ended up very similar. There was no reason not, there was like an optimal strategy basically. And so I included some really powerful rooms that would give you reasons why you wouldn't want to follow that optimal strategy. I added the dwarf leaders so that each game could be different. You would choose a different ability for your leader basically, and that would let you play the game in just a different way. I put down the name generator that I had created all the way back years and years ago, and then I added an achievement list because I always think that's fun in a solo game, just a reason to keep on playing and see if you can play it in different ways and get to different achievements. Then in 2022, I released a few different expansions. I released 13 Dwarves and a Burglar for free. This is my favorite expansion by far. Basically, I was rereading The Hobbit, and I realized, oh my gosh, when they went into the Mines of Moria, I needed to create an expansion like that for Dwarf Mine. So the idea here is after you're done with a game of Dwarf Mine, your mine has fallen, maybe the dragon's taken over your mine, then you pull out the 13 Dwarves and a Burglar expansion, and you can play a new game in that mine and see if you can take the mine back over. It's kind of fun. I also released 3 paid expansions that year. The first was Barrier Mountains. I love the fusion of sci-fi and fantasy. There is an old Dungeons and Dragons module called Barrier Peaks, I think, and I basically took direct inspiration from that to create Barrier Mountains. It's basically your dwarves stumble upon a mountain and some sort of ancient artifact from the skies has fallen and crashed in there, and you got to kind of figure it out while playing the game. I created the Magestone Mountain expansion. There's ley lines slicing across the mountain here, and you can draw rooms on those ley lines to gather magic, and that will allow you to cast different spells, especially at your enemies. And then finally, I released the Underdark expansion. The idea here is that your mine, you're always digging downwards. When you get to the bottom, you get to the Underdark, and from there you can build upwards, but you have to defend against the other creatures within the Underdark. So those expansions have always been fun. And then this year, I released one more expansion called Beyond the Mountain. One other piece of critical feedback that I've gotten on the game is that basically there's no way to win. It's a high score game essentially. The idea is that you play the game as long as you can until your dwarf population runs out, and then the game's over, and then you add up the amount of prestige your mine has earned, and that's your high score. You can also use the achievements list to kind of give yourself some goals within gameplay. But a lot of people were like, I want to win the game. How do I win the game? And so Beyond the Mountain helps the dwarves build a rocket ship, and from there you can potentially escape the mine, winning the game before your dwarven population falls down to 0. So I've really enjoyed building these expansions. I've gotten really good feedback about that, and this is where the game is today. So that is my design retrospective. I hope you enjoyed. Again, please let me know in the comments below what you thought of it. If you liked it, if you didn't like it, what we would think of more of these in the future. I also want to point out that right now, the Dwarf Mine, all the expansions are on sale in a bundle, and they're over 50% off. So if you haven't played Dwarf Mine, now is the best time to get it. It's not going to be this cheap again for a while. It's only $10 for all the expansions and the base game. So I would encourage you to check that out. The links are below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.